Good afternoon. As we wait for people to connect, I want to thank you for joining us for a discussion on Hamas and gender-based sexual violence. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our entire staff, our President, Mark Melman, our board and our board co-chairs, Todd Richmond and Ann Lewis, welcome. We know today's discussion is deeply disturbing and also a necessary one, and we thank you for joining us. In just a minute, I'll turn it over to our board co-chair, Ann Lewis, to introduce our distinguished guests. But first, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Please consider following us on social media. We're on Twitter or X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website, dmfi.org. And if you'd like to ask a question today, and I'll try to get to many of them, you can submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Or if you're watching on Facebook, you can type it into the comment section. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to our board co-chair, Ann Lewis.
Thank you, Rachel. I am so happy to introduce an old friend, Congresswoman Lois Frankel, who represents Florida's 22nd Congressional District. Is a dedicated and influential advocate for human rights, for international peace, and gender equality. And this is the latest example, her leadership in condemning Hamas's use of rape and sexual violence. She's working now to craft a bipartisan resolution that condemns rape as a tool of terror and trauma in warfare. Congresswoman Frankel has collaborated with fellow lawmakers in drafting a letter to UN Women, urging that organization to rise above their disgraceful silence and condemn the Hamas attacks. She has spoken out on the House floor and beyond, raising awareness about the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. And she continues to speak for the Israeli hostages who are still held captive. As we all know, that will be 100 days this Sunday. Congresswoman Frankel is co-chair of the Women, Peace, and Security Caucus in the House of Representatives, working to ensure that women play active and meaningful roles in all aspects of society, promoting human rights and the empowerment of women and girls worldwide. And I'm proud to call her my friend, Congresswoman Lois Frankel.
Thank you so much, Ann. I like to think we're longtime friends, not old friends. All right, we'll put it that way. Just so everybody knows, I'm actually speaking from a phone booth here in the back because we're on votes in the House of Representatives, so it looks a little dark where I am. But it's great to be with you all, and I want to just say, first of all, thank you not only to Ann, Rachel for your leadership, Mark Melman, and especially everybody who's associated with Democratic Majority Israel for not only hosting me today and others, but for your leadership and your advocacy for Israel, which I join you in. And thank you for this very serious discussion. I know that I'm going to be followed by two very excellent panelists. I actually should have gone last, but because I think they're going to really set the stage for the resolution I'm going to talk about. But believe it or not, I also chair the Women's Caucus here, and we actually have a briefing on sexual abuse in the Coast Guard just in the next few minutes. So, but I'll be leaving my very able teammate, Jen Miller, will stay on with you. So, I'm going to start by saying, repeat what Ann said. We're nearly 100 days into the war, and over 100 hostages remain in Gaza. And I will tell you that myself and many of my colleagues, we've met both with survivors, their families, and we will continue to do so and continue to call for the release of those in captivity. Today's subject is alarming and it's disturbing, and I'm going to put it in the words of Raz Cohn, the survivor of Hamas murderous rampage on October 7th. He was at the Nova Musical Festival on a day that was supposed to be filled with joy. In a chilling account, this is what he remembers. 5 men came out of a van and captured a woman, ripping off her clothes. They formed a circle around her. One raped her and killed her with a knife, and then he raped her again. And the men around the victim, they didn't seem Angry Roz said they always laughed. I think it was for fun. They murdered a lot of people for fun. And I still remember her voice, screams without words. Roz's story is just one account of the widespread, unimaginable crimes Hamas committed against Israelis on October 7th. Crimes that continue today against helpless hostages, some thought to be pregnant by their rapists. Israeli police have gathered thousands of testimonies from eyewitnesses of Hamas violence on October 7th, including accounts of rape, genital mutilation, and other forms of sexual violence. First responders and forensic units, and I know we're going to hear from one of them, have identified bodies subjected to trauma consistent with sexual violence, such as broken pelvises and gunshots to the genital areas. So we ask, where is the rage? And many Palestinian protesters are silent. The UN is now just getting into the game. Our voices, the voices of the world, must be loud, and they must be clear that rape and sexual violence are crimes against humanity and should never be used or accepted as a tool of war. From conflicts in Haiti, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and beyond, we see universal shrugs. And don't we all agree that we have a moral obligation to call out and condemn these crimes whenever and wherever they occur? So in that regard, I'm proud to lead a bipartisan resolution in the House of Representatives. Here's what it says, that this resolution condemns all rapes and forms of sexual violence as weapons of war, including those acts committed by Hamas terrorists on and since October 7th. It calls on all nations to criminalize rape and sexual assault and hold accountable all perpetrators of sexual violence, including state and non-state armed groups. It calls on all international bodies to unequivocally condemn the barbaric murder, rape, sexual assault, and kidnapping by Hamas and other terrorists on and since October 7th, and hold accountable all perpetrators. And it reaffirms the United States government's support for independent, impartial investigations of rape and sexual violence committed by Hamas on and since October 7th, and reaffirms the commitment to support survivors of rape and sexual violence, including those brutalized on and since October 7th. Now, here's the good news. We have support from both party leaders here in the House. And to date, in a very, very short time, over 100 members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, an even amount, amazingly enough, of crossing all philosophical bents, have signed on to this resolution. So your support and advocacy certainly greatly appreciated. And with that, I'm so sorry to hop out, but as I said, my team will stay on. Take careful notes, and we stand ready to work with you in any way that is reasonably possible. And again, Ann, thank you for the introduction, and Democratic Majority for Israel, thank you for all that you do. I stand with you all the way.
And you're on mute, but thank you, Congresswoman, very much.
Oops. And I thank you to my longtime friend, and now get to welcome a new friend. Simcha Greiniman is the proud father of 5 who has been a Zaka volunteer for over 32 years. Zaka is an Israeli volunteer-based organization primarily focused on providing emergency medical and rescue services. Its main mission: to assist in the identification and recovery of victims in mass casualty incidents such as terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and accidents. And I may say it is one more way in which Israel is so different. I know of no other country in which volunteers, year after year, do this difficult yet essential work. On October 7th, Mr. Greiniman was the commander of the unit that was assigned to respond to terrorist attacks on communities close to the Gaza Strip. He witnessed firsthand the devastation left in the wake of Hamas's infiltration and hideous massacre. We are so grateful for your service over the years and honored that you are taking time to share this painful experience with us. Welcome, Simcha Greiniman.
Hi. As you said, first of all, thank you for having me. And I thank everyone for listening to what we have to say. And well, it's not easy to go back to what we saw, what we dealt with, and going through houses, house by house, seeing on the scenes children killed, adults killed, women in different situations. We're not doctors, so we can't say that we saw women get raped, but we saw women half naked, leaning on their own beds. We saw women totally naked with objects, nails, and different things in their personal body parts. And dealing with the situation and going through what we saw again and again in different scenes in the kibbutzim and on different houses and different points of collecting the bodies. That's not easy at all. And to understand that when you walk into a house and you see an older person laying in her bed connected to machines, and what you see around her is a puddle of blood, butchered with knives, screwdrivers, different objects and things that were, you can't understand what you really see in front of your eyes. And this is what we were dealing and understanding that who could stand in front of you in this world and say nothing happened? Oh, we deny it. We dealt with this with our own hands, in our own eyes. Hundreds of bodies, children, women, parents to children, adults, older people, Holocaust survivors that went through this massive killing, beheaded, parts of the body were removed. There were some bodies that we couldn't identify the body because the situation. We couldn't know if it's a man or a woman because what happened over there. And these are things that we had to deal, and all the kibbutzim. It wasn't only in one place that you would say that, okay, it was in one point, maybe that area was barbarians or I don't know what. You're going through all the kibbutzim one by one, and every place you saw another story, another story, another story. Every house that you walk through, collecting the bodies, you can't believe what you're seeing in front of your eyes. And we saw a lot of things during my 32 years as a volunteer, an international volunteer. We went to different countries around the world to help. We were in Turkey, we were in Bombay, we were in Haiti. We go around the world helping everyone. Doesn't make difference if we're Jews, Muslims, Christians, doesn't make difference. We are God's precious things that God decided to bring to this world and created human. So we, as Zaka members, this is what we do. We make sure that what we collect, what we bring to the families, the opportunity to understand that the beloveds got to bury and they have where to mourn. They know where their children are. They know where their parents are. Women know where their husbands are. Husbands know where their wives are. And the family can continue strongly afterwards, living with the hard situation, but knowing that their beloveds are there. And that's what we did during these 2.5 weeks collecting the bodies. And from then until now, 13 weeks already, cleaning house by house, going, making sure that there are no remains left behind. That's what we're doing. Houses that were burned down, going through them one by one, sifting from side to side to make sure that we can identify something from these bodies that were burned in their houses. Cars, bones that were totally burned, that when we touched the bones became ashes. This is what we dealt. This is what we dealt. It's something that you cannot believe, and you cannot live with it by understanding what you did. We thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for, again, all that you have done. All I know you will go on, but thank you for sharing with us those moments of horror. We go now to our next speaker, Ms. Sarah Weiss Ma'udi. Ms. Weiss Ma'udi, who currently serves as the acting head of the Israeli Interagency Task Force on Sanctions at the Israeli Foreign Ministry. She also provides guidance to the MFA Multilateral Emergency Task Force on UN-related issues and addresses the issues of sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th, as we've just heard so movingly described by Simcha Greiniman. Ms. Weiss Ma'udi founded the MFA Women in Diplomacy Network in 2012. She remains an active member of the board. She was previously senior advisor and deputy team leader of the Legal, Budget, and Reform team for the 77th president of the U.S. General Assembly, the first time an Israeli was appointed to such a role. And may I say, as we all watch how difficult it is for Israel at the United Nations, our appreciation for that appointment and what it took to get it continues to grow. Prior to this, she served as the legal advisor and counterterrorism and sanctions expert for the Permanent Mission of Israel to the United Nations in New York from 2018 to 2022. Ms. Weiss Ma'udi's experience also includes leading the International Law Department at the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and before joining the MFA in 2007, working as a legal associate in Tel Aviv at the corporate firm of GKH. And we welcome Sarah Weiss Ma'udi. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for this kind introduction, and thank you for having me speak tonight on this very important topic. I am certainly not a hero like Simcha, who went to the scene and really was involved in the rescue efforts and saw firsthand the evidence. As Anne explained, I had just gotten back from a 5-year posting at the UN, 4 of which I was working for the Israel Permanent Mission to the UN as their legal advisor. This last year, I had the honor of working. Every year, there's a different president of the General Assembly, and they always pick a cabinet of a number of advisors from around the world. They have never even agreed to interview an Israeli. The last president, to his credit, President Shaba Karosi, the 77th president of the UN, picked me to be in his 30-person cabinet of diplomats from all over the world. And I think if you had asked me on October 6th what I thought about the UN, my answer would be my experience there, my answer would be very different than what I'm feeling today, or even on October 7th, and his events unfolded. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've been working on at the Foreign Ministry and what my role is, and some observations I have. As Anne mentioned, although I came back and my day job is working on U.S. sanctions on Russia and China and Israel's policies towards those. From the war on, I was taken and I've been working on the UN team, given my experience and expertise at the UN. So one of the things that Israel always does when it experiences an attack, be it a small attack or obviously a large massacre like this, would be to write complaint letters explaining what had happened. Now, sometimes this can be very bare bones of Hamas or Hezbollah hit us with a rocket of this and this type on this and this date. And we send that to the Security Council, to the each month there's a rotating president. ask it to be circulated to all Security Council members, usually send a copy to the Secretary General, and it's pretty straightforward. So right after joining the UN team, one of the things that I was asked to do, and it's an obvious one, I've done hundreds of these when I was working at the UN, was to prepare the complaint letters. Now, because this was an event with so many different aspects and so many different types of victims and so many different types of acts of violence, one thing that we did was look at the whole UN system and really write letters to all the different bodies, not just the Security Council to complain, but various bodies. This included UN Women, which is the umbrella organization that's supposed to advocate for women and equality for all women in the world. Every woman, every girl is supposed to be under the umbrella of UN Women, and one of their 4 principles is protecting women and girls from violence. We wrote, there's various different special representatives. So there's one that deals with sexual violence and conflict. There's one that deals with the children and violence. And really, we're looking at the whole system. There's UNICEF that you all known about that deals with, all children throughout the world, protecting children and advocating for children. But there was another component, rather than the usual letter where we would just explain what happened, or with the Houthis right now. We explained that there was another incident where they tried to fire rockets into Israel on such and such date, such and such time, using certain types of rockets. Here, we had hundreds, if not thousands, of visuals, because one of the things that Hamas did was not only decimate and butcher and massacre, torture, rape, do unspeakable acts of sexual and other kinds of violence in many different cities adjacent to the Gaza Strip in Israel proper. But another thing that they did to terrorize the Israeli population as a whole was to publish these images using social media, sometimes using the victims' phones themselves. I mean, horrifyingly, many of the victims' families found out what happened because they simply picked up the phone, sometimes used even the face of the deceased to open up the phone with the facial recognition, and then would send these horrific images. I can say, sitting in my bomb shelter in Rehovot, where I'm sitting right now, I started to receive in various different social groups these images in real time. I happen to have, just so you can understand that how each and every Israeli is affected. I was staying home with a child who had corona. My husband had gone with 2 out of 3 of my children, and we're in the south, in one right adjacent to one of the communities that had been attacked. At my sister-in-law's, 17 family members, including a baby that had just been born, were on lockdown until Sunday afternoon at noon. That was when they could first leave the house. So I'm seeing this in real time with rockets constantly. We must have had 30 or 40 rocket attacks starting at 6:30 in the morning. So one of the things that we did with these attacks was really compile not just the letter, but actually I sat for 3 days, unfortunately, and sifted through all the visual imagery that we had received, and then prepared thematic letters. Now, one of these topics, and the topic that we're talking about today, was really preparing letters with a dossier of visual and video imagery relevant to the relevant UN bodies. So UN Women, for example, got imagery of the violence that had been perpetrated against women and girls. Again, those are the people that are under their mandate. UNICEF got imagery of grotesque violence against children. That was one that I have to say I had done a lot. I needed to choose and do editorial decisions about what images I was going to put in, because there were so many. And some of them were just so grotesque, of charred bodies, that you couldn't even really tell what you were looking at. And so some of those I didn't even put in because you couldn't even really see what we were talking about. With the women and girls, obviously, we had started receiving, more information has come out since, but endless videos, definitely pointing, as Simcha mentioned to, and as one police colleague said, the bodies spoke for themselves. The bodies testified for what exactly had gone on. I keep on hearing that sentence from police, from pathologists. Simcha, in his presentation, definitely said pretty much the same thing. The bodies spoke for themselves, and unfortunately, most of the victims, not all, by the way, there are a number of victims that are still survivors that are being treated. Not all of them, most of them do not want to come forward. Something that's very typical, if any of you have worked in the realm of sexual violence and rape, many survivors will oftentimes take years for them to talk about their traumas. Now, what we had expected was, once the UN received, the Secretary General received this kind of information, there would be, an outcry. And we took this task, I will say, the MFA, particularly the women in the MFA working on, Israeli women working on this, with extreme, just huge responsibility. And I think this really talks to the fact that almost all of us, myself included, are grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren of survivors of this kind of violence. Be it in the Holocaust, in pogroms. In Iraq, you had a major pogrom, the Farhud, where this kind of sexual violence was rampant. You go back to the Inquisition and the descriptions there, and you go even further back, every generation. But the difference is that whereas in the past, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers sat with the pain and the shame, and they sat in silence, and this is the difference of why, and really one of the reasons why we need a Jewish state. One of the reasons they talk about after these events happen is, we have an army and we can go defend ourselves and we will not just roll over and play dead, but we also have a voice. And I feel an extreme responsibility. It's the reason why, by the way, I have 3 children in the background who all need my attention. And at 9 o'clock at night, I'm speaking to you, which is not something I usually do as a working mom. I got up already this week at 3:30 in the morning, as I do to be on the news in the States to talk about this issue. I've done about 50 interviews. We are, number one, the voice of all these victims. A lot of them are dead, and we feel an extreme responsibility to speak for them. But it's also part of being Israeli and holding our heads up high and saying that the shame is not on us and is not on our sisters, but is on the perpetrators of this crime. And we all have to be very clear about that. Now, we waited and waited and waited for someone to say something. Amazingly, at the UN, they had a session about violence against Palestinian women and girls, which is important to discuss. And I'm not saying that we should ignore the pain and suffering of all women and girls. But they wouldn't even allow, the Americans actually asked for a briefer from civil society, someone who'd worked in the UN system, to speak on behalf of Israeli victims. And the Security Council wouldn't even allow that civil society briefer, not an official briefer like myself, but a civil society briefer to even speak. I was just 3 weeks ago at the UN, and a congresswoman spoke about her amazing initiative to condemn Hamas and condemn these acts of rape. Well, I was sitting at the UN when the General Assembly rejected even a bare bones condemnation of Hamas, not even talking about these egregious acts of rape and murder. And you know what happened when that amendment was rejected? They wanted to add in the resolution just one sentence condemning Hamas. There was applause. Just think about how sickening that is. Thinking about me sitting there after I've sat for days in and days out, seeing image after image of bloodied sister and brother and cousin and just horrific scenes of Jewish victims, of Arab victims, of Muslim victims, of Christian victims, of Druze victims. It's just beyond belief and horrifying that the international world community, the government of governments, UN, they're sitting and applauding that they're not going to condemn Hamas. And the same thing, a shock that we waited literally 2 months until the UN organizations even started to say anything about this. In fact, the head of UN Women the day after October 7th not only ignored the issue, but blamed Israel for an escalation. Nothing about these acts, even though I knew very well as I had drafted them, the ambassador obviously sent the letter in his name and with his signature. I knew just what they had seen. I know what videos they had seen, what evidence they had seen. Now, I'm asked in many interviews how we can explain this. And I like to say there's three possible explanations. One's a very simple explanation, that it's just plain and simple. It's anti-Semitism. People hate Jews. And there's nothing more, and we don't have to go on beyond that. I'm not sure if that's the answer. I'm putting it out there. Another possible explanation is that many people at the UN see the world in such a skewed way that they would somehow believe that given the political situation in Israel, this is somehow justified to rape women, to burn babies. And just think about how grotesque that statement is, and the far-reaching consequences of having that kind of attitude, of saying that there are certain political situations that would justify raping our bodies or violating our bodies. That has consequences in the context of the Taliban, ISIS, or even Hamas back at home with the Palestinian women. If they think it's okay to rape Israeli women in certain circumstances, what about the Palestinian woman who opposes them or who decides to go off in the streets and possibly take off her hijab? So I think we have to be very careful about giving any sort of justification. Another explanation is that the UN is so biased, and maybe some of these bodies, the people that run them, are looking for their next job, and just know that if they say anything that's even slightly on the side of Israel, that they will be passed up because you know, we can, by a show of hands, we can blame Israel that the moon is purple with pink spots and it's Israel's fault, and that can pass at the UN given the political reality. I'm going to end with just what's the ask and what we've been advocating for. And I think this speaks to all of you. So first and foremost is, I think, as I said, we all have a duty to tell the story of the victims and make sure that the victims are feeling heard. We live in an era of after Me Too, and we believe you, that we believe them, that we embrace them, and that the shame is not on them. The shame is on Hamas and everyone who stayed silent. But more than that, when we're seeing international bodies that are supposedly advocating for women's rights and human rights, and we see them not doing their job, we need to be crystal clear that we demand that they do their job, that they do their job in an objective, in a transparent way, that there isn't this double standard against Israel. When they're choosing new leaders, we want to be very sure that they're not going to take these kind of positions against Israel, that they're going to do their job. It's just like a corporation. And, you know, I see the CEO of the UN as the Secretary General of Guterres, and he sets the tone. And here he has set the tone in a way that is unexcusable. This is not just criticism of Israel. This is, simply put, turning a blind eye to mass atrocity crimes, to crimes against humanity, to genocidal Hamas acts of violence, excusing it, saying that these things didn't occur in a vacuum. And then when the various leaders that are right under him are not doing their job, be it UNICEF that's supposed to advocate for children and doesn't mention that there are children and babies that are being held hostage in Gaza, when UN Women can't even say that rape is wrong, and they do it in every other context, and they should, with the Yazidis and in Ukraine. But where are they with the Israeli women? Or that they question us and say, well, that has to be investigated. That needs to end. And so I'll end here, and just one word, because I usually open my presentations, but like I said, it's very late at night. I also just want to, as I said at the beginning, remind everyone we're coming to, unfortunately, 100 days that all the hostages, including women, and here, but also men, also children, the elderly, I want to just say the other day we saw images of what the women look like in captivity, and it's just heartbreaking. And we think as we're dealing with all this sexual violence of just, God forbid, what they're going through, I want us all to just really, really keep this front and center, that we have to be advocates for all 136 hostages. We can't forget them. We have to talk about them. We have to advocate them, and we have to bring them home. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Weiss Ma'udi. We really appreciate your really insider's look at your experiences at the UN, and also, as you said, telling the stories of the victims. We have one person who's joined us, Lauren, who says, "I want to thank Ms. Ma'udi for all she has done and tried to do on behalf of Israel and for the Jewish people." So thank you very much. We're going to turn to the Q&A portion of the program. I'd like to bring Mr. Greiniman back into the conversation. Mr. Greiniman, you've been doing this work for more than 30 years. How do the victims and their families begin to heal?
Well, it's not easy to face it with the families, for sure. We try not to cope with the situation, or even to be the ones to spread it out to the families. For sure, we're questioned every so often about the situations, and we have to cope with it. It's not easy at all, but it's harder on the volunteers. Understand that Zaka is basically a whole group of volunteers. Each one has his own job, each one has his own regular day, what he does. And when we were called in, we came as volunteers to do whatever we need to do. And we do it right, on the best way. But when you see the situations, that's not something easy at all. And we hope that God gives us strength to continue doing whatever we're doing.
Thank you. How can, if folks are interested in learning more about Zaka or supporting Zaka, how could we do that?
Oh, Zaka's online. Just put Zaka, and automatically you'll learn about Zaka. And Zaka's members today are needed now more than ever, because in the 32 years that I am a volunteer, well, we had tragedies here and there around the world. And so we have a group of 5 or 10 guys going in and out, different situations, flying to different countries around the world. When you have it in your backyard, talking about 800 volunteers on the scenes, collecting hundreds of bodies in 2 weeks. You have to deal with all the volunteers afterwards, one by one, to get mental help, to go through sessions one by one, to be able to give them help, because what we saw, what we dealt with, this is something that I don't think someone would be able to do the job and getting paid. I don't think someone would come to do that. But because we're volunteers, when we're asked, we run to do our job. And that's our main thing, our main goal. Being a volunteer, being the right man at the right moment, and doing what we could do on the best way, that's our point. That's our goal.
Thank you, Mr. Greiniman. Ms. Weiss Ma'udi, we have a question from Richard. And Richard asks, although very late, I understand the UN is finally sending an investigator to look into the rape and sexual violence committed by Hamas. Do you have any faith that this will be an effective investigation? Also, will this include an investigation of continuing abuses being currently committed by Hamas to hostages?
So, as I said, there was an utter failure of leadership from UN Women, but UN Women was not the only one to receive our complaint letters. And indeed, the Secretary General has a number of special representatives that deal with thematic issues. And one of them, her name's Pramila Patton, She deals with sexual violence and conflict, as opposed to UN Women and their executive director. And we saw even a less senior employee who was actively advocating for Palestinians, for Hamas. Even though that's obviously against the rules of ethics. I worked for the UN last year. You're very, very clear that you don't do that, and you have to be neutral. But so Pramila Patten, the special representative for sexual violence, will be coming to Israel. It's not so much an investigation per se. I will say Israel has a very strong and vital democracy and legal system. And one of the things that we're doing, it's quite challenging, is really setting up the actual investigation and prosecution, not only of these kind of crimes, but all the various different types of crimes that were committed. I won't go into the details of what's going on, but obviously in the past, when even we dealt with prosecuting terrorist acts, we were talking about 1 or 2 cases, isolated cases that were manageable. Here, I think Simcha can speak for the fact that it took days just to take the bodies out of the scene. And part of the reason why also we were in shock and we didn't even quite know what had happened. Looking back as Monday morning quarterback, we could have maybe had police go in with rape kits. Zaka, that's not their specialty. They're tzaddikim, they're righteous people who do righteous work of God. But they're not forensic experts. And I don't blame them for not being forensic experts. It's not what usually. Unfortunately, in past terrorist attacks, it was to pick up pieces of bodies after a bus exploded. And this was very, very different and even more grotesque, if that makes any sense. So we're doing our own investigation domestically. There are different ideas that have been floated if we should set up a special tribunal and possibly maybe partner with other countries that have victims. These are all on the table being discussed. There are various different government agencies. The special representative will come, and first and foremost, she is going to speak to victims, to hostage families. She is going to obviously tour the areas in the South and have a full comprehensive, just to see what happened with her own eyes. We will see what happens after that. But again, first and foremost, it's for Israel to investigate, prosecute, and we're starting the process. It's going to be a lengthy and complicated process.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about media coverage of these atrocities in the US. We saw finally an investigation by the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal did one as well. Just deeply harrowing accounts. Of course, this is 3 months after October 7th. What is your take on the media attention to these specific crimes against humanity? Sarah, I'll start with you, please.
So, first of all, there were already major media outlets that were covering this already about a month and a half ago. For example, in France, Le Point did a huge piece, very detailed investigation. There was a reporter who came. I will say I've been involved with almost all of these reports. If you didn't see my name in them being interviewed, it was background briefings like I usually do as a legal advisor. I usually don't do frontal interviews. I do more like briefings like this kind of thing. But I think that certain media outlets really wanted to cross their T's and dot their I's and make sure they were getting, very verifying information from several different sources. I will say with the New York Times article, I think one of the, besides the grotesque images, and I was letting the audience, it's not for everyone to read. Some people, I give a trigger warning. It's very, very graphic and detailed. And by the way, the New York Times have run a number of pieces of visual videos of really seeing what happened. But one thing that's interesting is they show a map and they show that these acts of sexual violence actually happened in 7 or 8 different places at the same time in parallel. And the test is, as a lawyer in international law, if it's a crime against humanity, you have a war crime where you're not supposed to obviously rape as part of war. But then you have a crime against humanity, which is the next level up. if you can show it was widespread and systematic. And here, I think one of the more pertinent things from a legal point of view is that they're showing clearly that we're talking about widespread systematic. I will also say, as someone who has seen hours and hours of interviews of Hamas arrestees, one of the things that you notice in all the videos, I'm an Arabic speaker, is that it's very clear that they received instructions. This wasn't just one crazy person or two crazy people that got frenzied in one area. We're talking about that they came in with specific instructions. One of the most, I mean, it still sits with me, one of the interrogations, the fellow very calmly said, we were told to take the children aside to rape them. And then in English, they had translated to dirty them. But I was listening, I heard the word rape, which I know in Arabic, but then there was another word and I kept on listening to try and make it out. So I called an Arab friend of mine to ask, what is the second word? They said, oh, that's a word in Palestinian dialect that means to molest, oftentimes to molest boys. So it's not just to dirty them, it's really to just molest, like, you know, literally instructions to be molesting children. So these reports are very important because of the fact that we are seeing Holocaust-like denial from everyone from Princess Rania of Jordan to people on the media. And they're suddenly questioning, it's just like the classic old school rape cases. What were you wearing? And was your skirt too short? Or are you telling, your word against his word? And Hamas was very savvy. A lot of the images they put up right for several hours and then they erase them. And sort of, this is really a very savvy terrorist tool, because what did they do? They accomplished the goal of terrorizing all of us. I mean, I have a teenage daughter who days after the attack wouldn't walk to her job 2 blocks away, and I live in a totally middle-class safe area. Why? I said, are you afraid of the rockets? Because rockets have been going off in my city since October 7th. And she said, no, we have, the Iron Dome. I know how to lie on the floor. I can run away, but I'm afraid someone's going to rape me. This is my teenage daughter. This was not part of her vocabulary. This was not, we do not live in it. We live in a city that we can really, I can go out for a walk at 10 o'clock at night and never think about that, or I had never thought about that. So they managed to terrorize us, but also to gaslight us by then erasing them. And this is what's going on. So these reports, Rachel, to answer your question, are critical to document and tell the story, and not just as Israelis telling the story, but that the international community is recognizing it. And like I said, I would say everyone here, part of your job is to bear witness. I feel like I'm talking like my grandparents' generation about the Holocaust. And it was kind of like how I was feeling when I was seeing all those grotesque videos. At first, I just felt like, for lack of a better term, that I was looking at the pornography of violence, and it was jarring and it was traumatizing. I didn't sleep for 6 weeks afterwards. But the third day, I felt like, as an Israeli, as a Jew, this is my duty to bear witness, and it's going to be all of the people of our generation's duty to bear witness to this.
Thank you, Ms. Weiss Ma'udi. Mr. Greiniman, I wanted to, as we look to wrapping up our discussion, I wanted to ask you a final question. What can we do as Americans, Democratic majority for Israel, who care deeply about Israel and Israel's security and Israel's future? What else can we do to be advocates and raise awareness on these atrocities?
Well, we're asking that the world should understand and feel what we went through. And you can't come and deny in one side and then come complain on a different side about what happens here or what happens there. If you're asking for help anywhere around the world, Jews, Muslims, Christians, you have to give everyone the same way of looking. You can't close your eyes and say, they're Jews, we don't look at them. And I'm not saying it as a soldier, I'm not saying it as a Jew, I'm saying it as a human being. And humans have to look at humans and hope for peace. And when you're hoping for peace, it will happen. When you drive yourself into peace, you'll be able to succeed with what you're doing. And closing your eyes and saying it didn't happen, that's the worst part. Because what's going to happen tomorrow, we never know. And what's going on in Israel? Rockets are starting to fly from up north. We're scared. We're scared that anything that would happen around Gaza Strip can happen up north. And the world has to understand that this is where we stand as volunteers. Doing these things, collecting these bodies, standing here in front of you, standing on the UN, standing in front of the world, saying what we're saying. We're here to speak for the people that are not here. We're the voice. Because if they would be able to stand over here and speak what happened to them, they would be screaming their head. They would be screaming, and then everyone maybe would listen to them. But they're not here. Unfortunately, we're their eyes and hands. We're the people that did collect parts by parts, bodies by bodies, men, women, children, Holocaust survivors, people that are not with us anymore. And that's what we need the world to understand. And we appreciate the congressmen that come to Israel and see what they see, and they go around the kibbutzim and they see the situation, the burned houses, the broken houses, the families. They understand that we're still hoping to see all the people that were taken into Gaza as hostages. When they step on Israel's soul, then they see what happened to Israel. They understand what happened to Israel. By being across the world and saying, no, it didn't happen, that's hard. But whoever came is standing beside us, and they saw what happened in these kibbutzim. And we thank them. And we thank all the communities around the world that are hugging Israel and standing beside us. In these days, until now, Zaka had one understanding. Zaka stood for a very special point of view. Zaka stood for identifying bodies in different situations. But Zaka stands from Simcha Torah as another thing. Zihui ze kiruv achim. We're the people that are trying to combine and connect the Jewish community and the world for peace. To understand that humanity has to continue living in peace, and understanding that what we did is not something that we could happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greiniman. Thank you so much for being with us. Ms. Weiss Ma'udi, I'd like to give you the last minute before I hand it over to our board co-chair. What should we take away from the conversation today?
As I mentioned, I think that we really, each and every one of us has a duty, considering that the majority of victims of these heinous crimes are no longer with us, to tell their stories, to bear witness, and to make sure to stop denial in its tracks. We all have a duty to advocate until each and every hostage comes home. We all have a duty to explain just what Hamas is. And this doesn't mean that we're against the Palestinian people, because we're not. But Israel cannot, like, no country can tolerate having Hamas in their backyard or Hezbollah in their backyard. We are living in a situation, just to be clear, that tens of thousands of Israelis can't live in their homes right now. They cannot live in their homes right now. And we hear all the time about displaced Palestinians, but thousands of Israelis are displaced. And we need to have secure borders. We need to have a promising future. The Palestinians need to have a promising future too, by the way. And a promising future means not being run by a terrorist, ISIS-like, genocidal, rapist organization. They deserve better than that. The girls of Palestine, of Palestinian girls, deserve better than that as well. Let's just be clear about that. So I want to end on a note of just that we keep on being vigilant, to tell these stories, to advocate for the hostages, to advocate for a better future for Israelis, for Palestinians. And that means a future without Hezbollah on our backyards and without Hamas on our backyards. October 7th cannot happen again. No country would tolerate it, and we are not going to either. And so I thank you for this opportunity to speak to all of you tonight. I'm sorry, very sorry that it's on such a heavy topic. I'm hoping the next time we talk, it will be on something inspirational, because Israel is really, as much as the sadness, there's also so much inspiration. You saw the work that Zaka does, and just the amazing people who have, really citizens who have come together with volunteering efforts and just amazing initiatives. And with this tragedy, there's also opportunity, and it's a reminder also of what an amazing and special place Israel is. So I thank you all for your attention, and I hope to see you all in Israel sometime soon, and that we can celebrate something happy and really have a true Simchat Torah, one that was robbed from us this last year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Weiss Ma'udi, and Mr. Greiniman. Thank you for telling the stories of the victims and helping us all bear witness. I'm pleased to turn it over to our board co-chair, Todd Richmond.
Hi, everybody. If I just bear with us for another minute or two. First of all, Simcha and Sarah, thank you so much. Congresswoman, thank you for taking the time from your phone booth. We really appreciate it. You know, I just came back from Israel myself, and as I'm listening to Simcha, I'm looking through my photos, and I think this is really indicative of what Israel was like at that time. And I'm not so sure if you can see it, but this was on the door. This was on the door of a home where people in Kfar Aza were brutally murdered by Hamas. And on the top, it says, "Life is good." That is what the Israelis that were down there were like on October 6th. On October 7th, actually, this was, I think, on possibly even October 11th, because I think that's when Zaka was finally able to get in there. It says, "Checked and cleared by Zaka volunteers." And I think that really shows what was going on and what happened in Israel for Shabbat, for Simchat Torah, leading into this just horrendous attack on Israel. And you know, we just thank the two of you for being here today and for giving your words of encouragement, really. I mean, Simcha, you talk about peace, and Sarah, you talk about not forgetting. We're not going to forget. You know, we're wearing, you know, our Bring Them Home. You know, I have my thing, you know, in terms of, you know, the Nova Festival. We are working as hard as we can. And since October 7th, DMFI has really been on the front lines. And we've been in constant touch with our allies on Capitol Hill, supporting them with briefing materials and message points. We've been mobilizing, you know, our volunteers, our members, to write letters to members of the Congress. And I'm going to tell everybody on this call right now, go to house.gov, look up who your member of Congress is, and call them and tell them to support Israel. Because there are so many members of Congress. I was with one yesterday who was saying that the calls against Israel are great. And everybody on this phone call, the hundreds of people, you make that one call, that makes all the difference. We have shown the video, the Hamas brutality video, to staffers on the Hill because they need to learn. We did a Zoom on the law of war as well. And so we're continuing to be out there. But for our members that are listening to us today, we can't do all these programs. We can't do all this education. We can't do all this enlightenment with them unless we have, I hate to say it, the funds to enable us to do these things. So please go to dmfi.org, sign up, of course, and get our emails and get our alerts and you know, and take the bull by the horns and do all those things, but also support our organization so we can make sure, as Simcha was saying, these members of Congress that will go to Be'eri and Kfar Aza, and they'll be in Tel Aviv, like I was just there a few days ago, where we're going down into the basement, and we hear Iron Dome being used and defending the people of Israel, Jews, Muslims, Christians who are there. And it's because of the work of so many people on the Zoom, that have lobbied members of Congress to fund Iron Dome, to fund the Arrow missile system, which actually shot down a rocket from the Houthis. It's our activism. We are the second line, right? Sarah and Simcha, they're on the front lines. We're on the next line. So we need to keep working. But once again, we can only do it if our members and our volunteers are doing it with us. So actually, this is a lot more than I usually speak. But once again, thank you to the two of you. We will not forget. Bring them home now, and Am Yisrael Chai.